Claire Bennett had not planned to fall in love that night. She had barely planned to show up. She stood outside Maison, one of Manhattan's most quietly exclusive restaurants, the kind of place that didn't display its menu in the window because the people who dined there already knew what they wanted, and took a long breath of cold October air. Her arms were full. In her left hand, a diaper bag that had seen better days. In her right arm, her 3-year-old daughter Lily, fast asleep against her shoulder. One small fist curled around the strap of Claire's beige sweater, her breath warm and even against Claire's neck. "I must be out of my mind," Claire whispered to herself. She had said those exact words to her best friend Dana 40 minutes ago, standing in her bathroom, trying to apply mascara with one hand while holding Lily on her hip with the other. "For you're not out of your mind," Dana had said over the phone, her voice carrying the cheerful authority of someone who had arranged this entire situation and therefore bore full responsibility for its consequences. "You're a woman who deserves a nice dinner, and Lily is practically comatose. She won't even know she's there." "She's 3, Dana, not comatose. You know what I mean. She fell asleep in the car. Just carry her in. Put her on the seat next to you. Order something expensive. Let a man look at you like you're the most interesting thing he's seen all year. And if he walks out the moment he sees I brought a toddler to a blind date—" A brief pause. Then he's not worth your time. Claire had not found that particularly reassuring. She found it even less reassuring now, standing in front of a restaurant where the sommelier probably earned more than she did in a month, cradling her sleeping daughter and wearing the nicest sweater she owned, which was also the warmest, because October in New York did not negotiate. She had met Dana at the publishing house where they both worked, Dana in acquisitions, Claire in editorial. Claire had been with the company for 6 years, long enough to have survived 2 rounds of layoffs and one particularly brutal restructuring that had taken out half her department. She was good at her job, she was organized, she was precise, and she had an instinct for a good story that her supervisor, Margaret, called quietly remarkable, which was the most enthusiastic compliment Margaret had ever given anyone about anything. But Claire's personal life was a different story altogether. Lily's father, a man named Derek, had left when Lily was 8 months old. Not dramatically. There had been no screaming, no thrown plates, no devastating revelation. He had simply, gradually become someone who was always about to come back and never quite did. First it was a work trip to Chicago that extended itself, then an apartment he was temporarily renting with a friend, then a phone number that went to voicemail more often than not. By the time Lily turned 1, Claire had accepted the quiet, exhausting truth. She was doing this alone. She had moved from a 2-bedroom in Brooklyn to a smaller apartment in Queens, tightened every budget she had, and learned that single motherhood was not a tragedy, but it was, undeniably, a marathon with no finish line in sight. She wasn't bitter. That was the thing people always seemed surprised by. She wasn't bitter, and she wasn't broken. She was tired, yes, deeply bone-level tired in the way that only parents of small children fully understand, but she was also, on most mornings, genuinely grateful. Grateful for Lily's laugh, which sounded like small bells. Grateful for her job, which gave her purpose. Grateful for Dana, who periodically forced her back into the world of human connection, whether she was ready or not. Tonight was one of those nights. The man she was meeting, Nathan Cole, was someone Dana had described with unusual caution for someone who had orchestrated the meeting. "He's not like what you'd expect," Dana had said, which was not an answer. When Claire pressed, Dana had added only that he was in real estate and development, that he was single, that he was 36, and that a mutual contact had described him as someone who takes everything seriously except himself. Claire had looked him up, of course. She wasn't reckless. What she found was limited, a few references in business publications, a brief mention in a Forbes feature about Manhattan's evolving skyline, a single photograph that showed a dark-haired man in a suit at what appeared to be a charity gala, his expression composed and slightly distant, like someone who had learned very early how to be in a room without being read by it. He looked, she had thought, like someone who had never once arrived at a restaurant carrying a sleeping 3-year-old. She pushed the door open anyway. The interior of Maison was warm and low-lit, all dark wood and amber candlelight, the kind of lighting that made everyone look like a better version of themselves. A soft piano melody threaded through the ambient murmur of conversation. The host, a young man with the posture of someone who had been told repeatedly that posture mattered, glanced up from his stand and took in the scene before him with precisely 2 seconds of barely concealed surprise before recovering himself completely. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Are you Miss Bennet?" "I am," Claire said, adjusting Lily against her shoulder. "I apologize in advance." "Not at all." He reached for 2 menus. "Your guest has already arrived. Right this way." She followed him through the restaurant, aware of the glances, brief, polite, curious, that tracked the unusual sight of a woman in a beige sweater carrying a sleeping child through one of Manhattan's more serious dining establishments. She kept her chin up. She had learned, somewhere between Lily's first ear infection and her second set of molars, that the secret to surviving embarrassment was simply not to grant it permission to land. Nathan Cole was sitting at a corner table, his jacket still on, a glass of sparkling water in front of him, untouched. He was looking at his phone when she approached, and he looked up at exactly the moment she reached the table. He was taller than she'd expected, even seated. The photograph hadn't captured something about his face, a quality of attentiveness maybe, the sense that he was the kind of man who, once he looked at something, actually saw it. His eyes moved from her face to Lily in a single smooth motion, and something shifted in his expression, not displeasure, not the polite horror she had braced herself for, something quieter than that, something she couldn't name. He stood. Because of course he stood. This was clearly a man who stood when a woman approached a table, a reflex so automatic it probably predated conscious thought. "Claire," he said, not a question. "Nathan." She shifted Lily's weight carefully. "I owe you an explanation." He looked at Lily again, at the small fist still curled in the fabric of Claire's sweater, at the child's slow, steady breath, at the way Claire's whole posture had organized itself around the weight of her daughter with the unconscious precision of someone who had been doing this for years. Then he did something Claire had not expected. He reached out and gently pulled the chair beside her, not across from her, beside her, away from the table, creating a small, careful space. "She can rest here," he said quietly, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "There's enough room." Claire stared at him for a moment. "You're not going to leave?" she asked, and immediately wished she hadn't, because the question revealed more than she intended. Nathan sat back down. He picked up his water glass, considered it briefly, and set it down again. "Why would I leave, he said. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Bennet did not have an answer. Claire settled Lily carefully into the chair Nathan had pulled out, folding her own cardigan around the little girl's shoulders like a makeshift blanket. Lily stirred once, a small sound, a twitch of her fingers, and then sank back into the deep, boneless sleep that only very young children seemed capable of. Claire watched her for a moment, the way she always did, with that particular mix of fierce love and exhausted wonder that had become the background noise of her entire existence. Then she sat down, smoothed the front of her sweater, and looked across the table at a man who had not yet given her a single reason to distrust him, which in her experience was itself a reason to proceed with caution. "She's beautiful," Nathan said. He wasn't looking at Claire when he said it. He was still looking at Lily, and there was something in his expression that wasn't performance. No calculated warmth, no social obligation, just a quiet, unguarded observation. "Her name is Lily," Claire said. "She's 3, and I know this isn't what you signed up for tonight." "What did I sign up for?" "Dinner with a woman you've never met." She reached for the water glass in front of her. "Not dinner with a woman you've never met, and her sleeping daughter and a diaper bag that has a cartoon elephant on it." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I've had worse evenings," he said. The waiter appeared, a man of perhaps 50 with the quiet efficiency of someone who had navigated 1,000 unusual situations and classified this one, apparently, as entirely manageable. He took their drink orders without commentary. Nathan ordered a glass of red wine. Claire, after a half-second of internal debate, ordered the same. Dana tells me you're in editorial, Nathan said, once they were alone again. She tells me you're in real estate, Claire replied. Development mostly, acquiring undervalued properties, rebuilding them. He said it the way people described work they were good at, but didn't need to perform enthusiasm about. It's less glamorous than it sounds. It doesn't sound that glamorous. This time he did smile. It rearranged his face entirely, softened the composed distance she'd noticed in that photograph, made him look younger and somehow more present. Fair point, he said. The wine arrived. They settled into the particular rhythm of two people who were both intelligent enough to know that first conversations were less about information and more about calibration, figuring out not just what the other person said, but how they said it, what they left out, where the edges were. Claire discovered over the course of the next 40 minutes that Nathan Cole was not what she had expected. He was not the smooth, self-congratulatory version of wealthy she had steeled herself against. He didn't mention his portfolio unprompted. He didn't check his phone. He asked about her work with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and when she described a manuscript she'd spent the last 3 weeks editing, a debut novel about a Haitian immigrant navigating the healthcare system in New York, he asked follow-up questions that were specific and considered, not polite. He was also, she noticed, watching Lily with an attention that he clearly thought he was concealing. Every few minutes his gaze would drift to the small, sleeping figure in the chair beside Claire and then back again, as if he were checking on something he couldn't quite leave alone. She decided to address it directly. "You keep looking at her," she said. He didn't pretend he hadn't been. "I know." A brief pause. "I had a younger sister. She used to fall asleep like that, anywhere, anytime. Car seats, grocery carts. Once at a baseball game in the middle of the 7th inning, sitting completely upright." Claire watched his face. "Used to." The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hand moved almost imperceptibly on the table. "She passed away," he said. 8 years ago. She was 22. He said it with the controlled steadiness of someone who had said the sentence many times and had learned through sheer repetition to carry it without flinching. "Car accident, black ice on the Merritt Parkway, coming home for Thanksgiving." "I'm sorry," Claire said, and she meant it in the full, uncomplicated way that didn't need decoration. "Thank you." He looked at his wine glass. She would have liked tonight, actually. She had a talent for finding the absurd thing in any situation and deciding it was the best part. The absurd thing being me walking into a restaurant with a 3-year-old. "The absurd thing being that you walked in anyway," he said, and looked up. "That takes something." Claire felt the words settle somewhere specific in her chest, in a place that had been defended for a long time. She redirected, gently. "What made you agree to a blind date, honestly?" He considered this for a moment, as if the honest answer required a moment's assembly. "I've been told," he said slowly, "by more than one person whose opinion I respect, that I am very good at building things, and very poor at letting anything actually reach me." He turned the wineglass once. "I thought maybe doing something I wouldn't normally do might produce a result I wouldn't normally get." That's surprisingly self-aware for a billionaire. She hadn't meant to say the last word quite so plainly. It arrived in the air between them and sat there. He didn't flinch. "Is that what Dana told you?" "Forbes told me. Dana told me you were in real estate." Something crossed his face then, a flicker of something she couldn't immediately classify. Amusement, maybe, or its more complicated cousin. "Dana tends to simplify," he said, carefully. "She does," Claire agreed, "though in this case I don't think Billionaire simplifies anything. It just adds several zeros to whatever I was already nervous about." "You don't seem nervous." "I'm extremely nervous. I've just had 3 years of practice pretending I'm not, because toddlers can smell fear." He laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind that couldn't be manufactured. It transformed him again, and Claire had the unsettling sense that she was seeing in small intervals the real person underneath the composed exterior, and that the real person was considerably more dangerous to her equilibrium than any photograph or Forbes article had suggested. Lily shifted in her chair. A small sound, not quite a word, not quite a whimper. Claire's hand moved automatically to the little girl's back, a steady, gentle pressure, and Lily settled again. Nathan watched this. He watched Claire's hand on Lily's back, the instinctive, unhesitating ease of it, and something in his expression moved in a way that he did not appear to have authorized. "She's lucky," he said quietly, "to have someone who moves like that for her." Claire looked at him. "Moves like what?" "Like you'd catch her before you'd even decided to." It was the most precise thing anyone had said to her in years, maybe ever. She didn't have a response for it, so she picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip and looked out at the amber-lit room around them, at the other tables with their ordinary evenings, and thought about how strange it was that the most unexpectedly real conversation she'd had in 3 years was happening in a restaurant she could never afford, next to her sleeping daughter, across from a man she had met 50 minutes ago. She thought about Derek briefly, the slow disappearing act, the voicemails, the silence. She thought about all the evenings she had eaten dinner standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at a table alone after Lily was in bed felt like something she wasn't ready to do. She thought about Dana saying, "You're a woman who deserves a nice dinner." And then the waiter arrived with their food, and Nathan looked up and said something quiet to him about adjusting the candle on the table so the light wouldn't fall on Lily's face, and the waiter nodded and did it. And Claire watched this small, unrequested, completely unnecessary act of consideration and felt something shift inside her, a door long locked moving on its hinges, not open, not yet, but no longer entirely shut. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting in that warm restaurant with her wine and her sleeping daughter and this man who had not yet told her the full truth about himself, was that Nathan Cole had not found out about this blind date the way Dana had told her he had, and the reason he had agreed to it was far more complicated than self-improvement. There was a connection between them, thin as a thread, older than this evening, that neither of them had yet pulled on. But threads, left alone, have a way of tightening on their own. The evening had stretched itself in the pleasant, unhurried way that good conversations sometimes do, the kind where you look up and realize the restaurant has quietly emptied around you and the waitstaff is performing the gentle choreography of a place that would like to close, but is too professional to say so directly. Nathan had noticed 20 minutes ago. He hadn't mentioned it. Claire noticed now, glancing around at the thinning room, and felt the particular embarrassment of someone who had been so absorbed in something that they'd forgotten to monitor the practical edges of the situation. "We should probably go," she said. "Probably," Nathan agreed without moving. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then they both, almost simultaneously, reached for the last of their wine. The bill arrived. Nathan took it before Claire could process that it had landed on the table, and when she started to object, he said, "Please, just the single word, quiet and without elaboration," and something in the simplicity of it made her stop. She began gathering Lily's things, the diaper bag with its cartoon elephant, the small cardigan she'd used as a blanket, the stuffed rabbit named Gerald that Lily carried everywhere, and that had apparently migrated from the bag to the chair at some point during the evening without anyone noticing. She tucked Gerald under Lily's arm and then lifted her daughter carefully, the way she had done 10,000 times, and Lily curled against her without waking, one hand finding its familiar grip on Claire's shoulder. Nathan held the door. Outside, the October air had sharpened since she'd arrived. The street was quiet, that particular midnight quiet of a Manhattan side street where the city doesn't go silent so much as it drops to a lower frequency, a hum rather than a roar. Claire shifted Lily's weight and turned to face Nathan on the sidewalk and understood that this was the part of the evening where things were decided, even when no decision was announced. "I had a really good time," she said, which I didn't expect to say, so I'm saying it plainly. "I had a really good time," he said, which I also didn't expect, so. A cab turned the corner 2 blocks down, its light on. Claire raised her hand automatically. "Can I call you?" Nathan asked. She looked at him. In the streetlight, with the city behind him and his jacket collar turned slightly up against the cold. He looked less like a Forbes photograph and more like a person, a specific, complicated, quietly watchful person who had spent the evening making small gestures that added up to something she didn't have a clean word for yet. "Yes," she said, "you can call me." The cab pulled up. Nathan opened the door, which she had not asked him to do. She settled Lily across the back seat, buckled her in with the focused efficiency of practice, and straightened up. He was still standing there. "Good night, Claire," he said. "Good night, Nathan." She got in. The cab pulled away. She looked straight ahead and did not allow herself to look back because she was 31 years old, and she had earned the right to maintain at least the appearance of composure. She lasted 4 seconds before she looked back. He was still standing on the sidewalk, watching the cab. And when she turned, even through the rear window and the distance and the dark, she was almost certain she saw him do something she would think about for a long time afterward. He smiled. He called the next day. Not in the evening, when it would have seemed calculated, and not in the morning when it would have seemed eager to the point of anxiety. He called at 2:17 in the afternoon, which Claire later decided was either perfectly natural or extremely precise, and she was never entirely sure which. They talked for 40 minutes. Then they made a plan for the following Saturday. Over the next 3 weeks, Nathan and Claire met 4 more times. Coffee on a Tuesday, a walk through Riverside Park on a Sunday morning, during which Lily, who had been told only that Mommy's friend was joining them, spent 45 minutes explaining to Nathan the complete taxonomy of clouds as she understood it, which was detailed and largely invented and entirely confident. Nathan had listened to every word. "She told me that the big flat ones are called blanket clouds," he said to Claire later, while Lily ran ahead on the path, "and that they happen when the sky is cold." "She's been developing her own meteorological system for about 6 months, Claire said. "I've stopped correcting her." "Why would you correct her?" He sounded genuinely puzzled. It was the kind of thing that accumulated quietly. The small, consistent ways he showed up that weren't performances of consideration, but seemed to be the actual texture of who he was. He remembered things. He followed up on things she mentioned in passing. When she told him about a difficult conversation she'd had with her supervisor over a manuscript decision, he asked about it 2 days later, not because he was being strategic, but because she came to understand he simply paid attention. She was falling for him. She knew it with the same certainty she applied to manuscripts, that bone-level recognition of something real beneath the surface. And then, on a Wednesday evening in early November, Dana called. "I have to tell you something," Dana said without preamble, which was always a signal that what followed would require sitting down. Claire sat down. "Nathan didn't come to the blind date because of a mutual contact," Dana said. "I mean, he did, technically. But the contact wasn't random. Claire, the person who connected us to Nathan, was Richard Ellison." Claire went very still. Richard Ellison was the name she hadn't said out loud in almost 2 years. He was a senior partner at a real estate investment firm, and he was also, relevant to the current conversation, the man who had purchased the publishing house where Claire worked 18 months ago as part of a larger acquisition. The restructuring that had followed, the one that had taken out half her department, had been his. She had kept her job, others hadn't. She had signed forms, attended meetings, smiled at people in corridors, while understanding that the ground beneath the company had fundamentally changed, and that the change had a name, and the name was Richard Ellison. She also knew, because Dana had told her at the time, and because it was the kind of thing that was difficult to unknow, that Richard Ellison was Nathan Cole's business partner. "Dana," Claire said carefully, "what exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Richard suggested Nathan for the date. Richard knows about you, about your work, about Lily, and he thought—" Dana paused. "Honestly, Claire, I don't fully know what he thought, but when I asked Nathan directly last night, yes, I called him, don't be mad, he told me that Richard mentioned you to him months ago, before I even approached Nathan about the date." "Months ago," Claire repeated. "Richard apparently said, and this is Nathan's version, so take it as you will, that you were the most capable person in the building, and that you'd been treated badly by the restructuring, and that someone should do something about that." The silence on the line stretched. "Someone should do something about that," Claire said slowly. "And the something was setting me up on a blind date with his business partner. I know how it sounds. It sounds like charity, Dana. Or it sounds like a man who noticed something about you and didn't know what to do with that information, so he handed it to someone else," Dana said. "Which is arguably more human than charitable." Claire stared at the wall of her apartment, at the crayon drawing Lily had made last week and stuck to the plaster with a piece of tape. A drawing that was supposed to be a horse, but looked more like a table with feelings. "Has Nathan said anything to you about this?" she asked. "Has he tried to tell me himself?" A pause. "I don't know. Maybe he was working up to it." "Or maybe," Claire said quietly, "he never planned to." She hung up and sat for a long time in the silence of her apartment, with Lily asleep down the hall and the city doing its low nighttime hum outside the window, and she felt the particular ache of something she had just started believing in developing, without warning, a crack. She thought about the evening at Maison, the chair he'd pulled out for Lily, the candle he'd asked the waiter to move, the way he'd stood on the sidewalk and watched the cab. She thought about 40-minute phone calls and blanket clouds, and the way he listened. She thought about Richard Ellison and the word charity, and all the distance between what something looked like and what it actually was. And she thought about the manuscript she was currently editing, the one about the woman who had survived something difficult, and the note she had written in the margin of chapter 12, a note that said simply, "The hardest thing is not the betrayal, it's deciding what to do with the version of someone you already love." She had written that about a fictional character. She had not expected to need it so soon for herself. She didn't call him that night. She didn't call him the next morning either, though she picked up her phone twice and set it back down with the careful deliberateness of someone diffusing something. She went through the motions of her Wednesday, got Lily dressed, made oatmeal with the blueberries Lily would eat, only if they were arranged in a smiley face, dropped her at daycare, took the subway to work. She sat at her desk and opened the manuscript she'd been editing and stared at chapter 12 for 11 minutes without reading a single word. Margaret stopped by her office at 10. "You look like someone who slept 4 hours, Margaret said, which from Margaret was practically an expression of maternal concern. "I'm fine," Claire said. Margaret looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, decided that was enough, and left. Claire closed the manuscript and opened a blank document and typed, without planning to, a single sentence. "What do you do when the thing that made you hopeful turns out to have a history you weren't told about?" She stared at it. Then she deleted it. Then she went and got coffee from the break room and stood at the window looking out at the city below. The grid of streets, the yellow cabs, the ordinary relentless forward motion of 11 million people who all had their own version of this problem. And she made a decision, not the decision she expected to make. She called Nathan. He picked up on the second ring. "Claire." "I talked to Dana," she said. A pause, brief but present. "I know," he said. "She called me after she called you." "Then you know what I want to talk about." "Yes." Another pause, and she could hear him doing what she'd come to recognize as his particular form of gathering himself. That slight, almost imperceptible settling before he said something he meant to say carefully. "Can we meet? Not a restaurant. Somewhere you feel comfortable. Your neighborhood, wherever you want." She almost said no. She felt the reflex of it, the self-protective instinct that had kept her functioning for 3 years, the part of her that had learned to treat the closing of doors as a form of competence. But there was the other part, the part that had walked into Maison with a sleeping daughter and a cartoon elephant diaper bag, and refused, on principle, to pretend she was anything other than what she was. That part said yes. They met at a coffee shop on her block, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and no ambient piano. Claire was already there when Nathan arrived, both hands around a ceramic mug, and she watched him come through the door and scan the room and find her. And she noticed, because she couldn't help noticing, that some fundamental thing in his posture changed when he saw her. Loosened, maybe. Like a held breath. He sat down across from her. He didn't order anything. Richard mentioned you to me in February, he said, no preamble. He said there was a woman at the publishing house who had handled the restructuring with more dignity than it deserved, and that she was raising a daughter alone and doing extraordinary work, and that he admired her. He paused. He said it the way you mention someone when you feel like you owe them something you don't know how to pay. Claire wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. He doesn't owe me anything. I think he feels differently. Nathan looked at the table for a moment. When Dana approached me about the blind date months later, she didn't know about Richard's conversation with me. That part is true. She genuinely thought it was coincidence. But when she mentioned your name, I recognized it. And I should have told you that from the beginning. He looked up. I didn't because I was afraid it would sound like exactly what you're thinking it sounds like. Which is, that I showed up out of obligation, or worse, out of pity. He said the word flatly, without flinching from it. And I need you to know that neither of those things is what happened inside that restaurant. From the moment you walked in with Lily on your shoulder and asked me if I was going to leave, nothing about that evening had anything to do with Richard Ellison or restructurings or anything except... He stopped. Except what? Claire said quietly. Except you, he said. Just exactly you. The coffee shop hummed around them. Someone at the counter ordered a latte. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop. Claire looked at this man, this precise, watchful, quietly careful man who had moved a candle so the light wouldn't fall on her daughter's face and stood on a sidewalk in the cold, watching a cab until it turned the corner. And she thought about what she'd written in the margin of that manuscript. The hardest thing is not the betrayal. It's deciding what to do with the version of someone you already love. She hadn't been betrayed. She understood that now, sitting here with clear eyes. He had withheld something, out of fear, out of the very human calculation that some truths delivered too early can prevent something good from having the chance to become itself. It wasn't noble, but it was recognizable. She had done versions of it herself. Everyone who had ever wanted something they were afraid to lose had done versions of it. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it the same way you would if there were no good or bad answer, just true or not true. All right. Did you come to that dinner because you wanted to? Not because Richard made you feel responsible, not because Dana set it up. Did you want to be there? He didn't hesitate. I drove past the restaurant twice before I parked, he said. I sat at that table for 20 minutes before you arrived and nearly talked myself into leaving 4 separate times. Not because I didn't want to be there, because I did, and wanting something that much makes it easy to ruin. He held her gaze. I wanted to be there. Claire set down her mug. She thought about February when she'd been eating dinner standing at her kitchen counter, not ready to sit at a table alone. She thought about Lily's blanket clouds and Gerald the rabbit, and the way Nathan had listened to a 3-year-old explain the entire sky as if it were the most important briefing he'd received all year. Okay, she said. He blinked. Okay? That's a true answer, she said. I can tell the difference. Something moved across his face. Relief, maybe, or the close relative of it, that looks like a person remembering how to breathe. I want to keep seeing you, he said, if that's still possible. I want to do it honestly this time, from the beginning. No history I haven't told you about, no information I'm managing. A pause. Full disclosure. I once cried at the end of a documentary about a rescued greyhound, and I overcommit to home renovation projects that I don't finish, and I'm told I become unbearable during baseball playoffs. Despite everything, despite the last 18 hours, despite the tight coil of hurt that had sat in her chest all morning, Claire laughed, a real one. I once fed Lily cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row because I was on deadline and forgot to go to the grocery store, and she said, and I have strong opinions about manuscript margins that most people find exhausting, and I will never, under any circumstances, be on time for anything ever again, because I now operate on toddler scheduling, which is not real scheduling. I can work with that, he said. You say that now. I mean it now, he said. I'll mean it later too. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had been doing in small ways all along. She let him in. Not all the way. Not yet. Not in the sweeping, cinematic way that erases complexity, but in the real way, the sustainable way, the way that acknowledges that trust is not a door you open once, but a practice you return to every day and choose again. "There's a thing Lily does on Sunday mornings," Claire said. "She makes pancakes, or she helps me make pancakes, which means she mostly adds too much baking powder and narrates everything at high volume. It's chaotic, and it takes twice as long as it should." She paused. "If you wanted to come sometime." Nathan Cole, who had driven past the restaurant twice and nearly left 4 times and spent 8 years learning how to be in rooms without letting anything reach him, looked at the woman across the coffee shop table, the woman who had walked into one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants with a sleeping child on her shoulder and not 1 ounce of apology, and said, "I'll bring orange juice." And that, as it turned out, was exactly the right answer. 3 months later, Lily would tell anyone who asked that Nathan was really good at pancakes, which was not true. He was, objectively, a worse cook than Claire, but he had learned to add the baking powder slowly, and he always let her stir, and he never once got tired of hearing about blanket clouds. And Claire, standing at the kitchen counter on an ordinary Sunday morning with the smell of coffee in the air and the sound of her daughter's laughter threading through the apartment, thought about a woman who had stood on a sidewalk outside a restaurant she couldn't afford, in a sweater she'd owned for 3 years holding a sleeping child, and decided to push the door open anyway. She was glad she had. She was very, very glad she had.